Hi there, here's a video explanation for fugitives and the court. So, once upon a time, we learned about the Compromise of 1850, which was an attempt to continue to settle the dispute out west over the issue of slavery and what territories would allow slavery, which territories would not, and how a balance of power would be maintained in the Senate. So in 1850, after the gold rush, remember that California wanted to join the Union as a free state, which would theoretically throw off the balance of power between slave and free states. So Senator Henry Clay suggested a compromise which would add two new territories, not states but territories, and that those two new territories would allow for popular sovereignty, where the voters in those territories would decide whether or not they would allow slavery. One piece of that Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Law, and that's what we're going to focus on in this lesson. So Northerners are happy with this compromise because they get a free state. Both sides are somewhat happy about popular sovereignty because depending on the outcome of the vote, they may get the outcome that they want. But the South is going to be very happy. The slave states are going to be very happy about this fugitive slave law. So there had been fugitive slave laws in the United States in the past. In fact, the U.S. Constitution includes a fugitive slave clause that would allow for the return of runaway slaves, but it wasn't often enforced. There weren't clear rules for who would be capturing or returning slaves and how that system would work. So this new Fugitive Slave Law or Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 would be much more strict, and it would require that runaway slaves be returned to their owners. So essentially, people who were accused of being runaways could be held, they could be arrested without a warrant, without any real documentation, and they could be sold into slavery. So those who had escaped slavery to the north along the Underground Railroad, they could be recaptured at any point and sold back into slavery. But it also meant that those who had never even been a slave, so African Americans who were living in the North who had never visited the South, had never been a slave, could also potentially be sold into slavery. All it required is that someone would accuse them of being a fugitive, and in court they would have to prove in some way that they were in fact a runaway slave, and then they could be sold into slavery. And so this became a very terrifying thing for the black population in America, where no one was safe. Anyone could be taken and sold into slavery at any point. Furthermore, this law required the assistance of the population, the United States, to help capture fugitive slaves. So anyone who helped a fugitive slave, say along the Underground Railroad, could potentially be fined or imprisoned. So there was a 6-month jail sentence and a $1,000 fine for anyone who refused to turn over a fugitive slave or was caught assisting a slave to run away. So a $1,000 fine in today's money would be roughly $35,000. So this is a pretty steep penalty. And these trials in which a fugitive is accused of being a runaway, of having escaped, would be held without a jury, and judges would be paid based on the decision that they gave. Those who were accused could not testify to defend themselves. There's very little documentation that was needed for someone to be found guilty, and judges in these cases would be paid twice as much to find an accused fugitive to be guilty than if they found them to be innocent. So there was an incentive baked in for these judges to find someone guilty of being a runaway. And so we have this system where there are essentially bounty hunters who are capturing runaway slaves or just accusing people of being runaway slaves so that they can be sold back into slavery. Southerners felt that this was a very reasonable law because they considered slaves to be their property, But Northerners were incredibly upset because not only was this an unfair situation, but it also was now requiring Northerners to assist in the process of returning runaway slaves. So perhaps in the past, a Northerner could simply avoid the issue of slavery and pretend that it wasn't a problem. Now they're being implicated in the slave system because they could be penalized for assisting someone in trying to gain their freedom. So in 1857, things take another step with a very infamous Supreme Court case called Dred Scott v. Sanford. So in 1857, we have this Supreme Court case that is known for being the worst Supreme Court case decisions in history. So Dred Scott, who you see in the top right corner there, was a slave owned by a man named John Emerson in Missouri, which we know was a slave state. And through the course of a number of years, starting in the 1830s, Dred Scott was brought by John Emerson, his owner, to Illinois, which was a free state where they lived for a while, and Wisconsin, which was a free territory where they lived for a while. In the early 1840s, they returned to Missouri, that slave state, where John Emerson died in 1843. Then all of John Emerson's possessions were given to his widow, so his wife, and Dred Scott claimed that he should be free, but Emerson's widow refused to allow him to go free. She then gave all of Emerson's property to Emerson's brother, a guy named John Sanford, and Dred Scott believed that he should be free because he had lived in free territory. So his owner had died. His ownership was transferred to his owner's wife and now to the wife's brother. And he believed that he should now be free and at least be able to purchase his freedom. The Supreme Court, however, who was led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, and you see him on the bottom right, who was a Southerner, ruled 7-2 against Dred Scott. And the implications of this decision were very extreme. So the three main arguments that the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roger Taney made were, number one, that Congress could not declare slavery to be illegal in any territory. So essentially the Missouri Compromise, which drew that line defining where slaves would be allowed and where they would not, and the idea of popular sovereignty are unconstitutional. The Constitution cannot, says that the government cannot prevent the ownership of slaves in any territory. It also said that slaves were property, that as such they belonged to their owners and did not have certain rights. And finally, that slaves were not citizens, nor could they ever be citizens of the United States, and therefore they could not file lawsuits. So Dred Scott does not even have the right to appear in court to request his freedom or to sue for his freedom. It is widely regarded as the worst Supreme Court decision in American history. And here's essentially what was said by the court, that a person cannot be deprived of their property, in this case that would be Dred Scott, because of the Fifth Amendment, which says that no person shall be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so a slave owner's property rights could not be limited or taken away by a state or federal law. Hope this video helps you understand the Fugitive Slave Law, the Dred Scott decision, and how these essentially fanned the flames that would lead toward the Civil War.